very good morning, and good morning to all of you. The gentleman who is sitting next to me needs no introduction. However, I can't resist. From being a banker, he became a start-upper. Banker with Salomon Brothers for a few years, heading it, of course. And then Mr. Bloomberg decided to set up this company and be a start-upper. Started in one-room office. Today, Bloomberg has 19,000 employees in 120 countries around the world, and many, many screens in this place, I can assure you.
Not enough.
All right, here we go. Probably one of the best salesmen in the world, in addition to everything else. So that was not enough. Moved from that to being the highly, highly valued and respected mayor of New York. And you were mayor of New York for 3 terms in a row, and clearly focused on job creation, improving public health, and transforming New York's public school system. Now, he could have rested on his laurels. No. He then moved on to actually not only being a philanthropist, not only being a very enlightened amateur, as I would say in French, of art, music, but he also decided to take on public good, and he was appointed, I want to get your title perfectly right, you were appointed UN Special Envoy for Cities and Climate Change. That was at the UN level. Because you were doing such a job and were really using all your standing image, reputation for that cause, the World Health Organization appointed you WHO Global Ambassador for Non-Communicable Disease. Now, before I go back to non-communicable disease, which is the first thing that I want to discuss with you, Michael, I would just like to encourage you to all tweet with the hashtag #OneOnOne Lagarde. This is a series that we have, and I will ask you at the end of our discussion a series of ritual questions that we have asked to others before. Now, I just mentioned your appointment as WHO Global Ambassador, and I would like you to tell us what are the NDCs, why do they matter so much, and if you could discuss with us the combat that you are leading in approaching these diseases.
Well, non-communicable disease is something that you don't get by interaction with other people. So cancer would be a good example. Generally, non-communicable diseases you get because of behavior that you control. So, for example, if you smoke, the likelihood of getting cancer is much higher. You can't blame anybody else. It's just yourself. And what's happened in the world is more people are now dying from non-communicable diseases, which means things that they could prevent, generally, than they are from communicable diseases. And that's particularly happening in the less developed countries, which is fascinating because they didn't have the wherewithal or the ways to get themselves sick. But all of a sudden, they can afford things that they couldn't do before, and it's hurting their health. Something like 70% of all deaths come from non-communicable diseases rather than communicable diseases, but we only spend 1% of our healthcare budget on non-communicable diseases, or research on non-communicable diseases, as opposed to the communicable ones. So we're not focusing on where the problem is, and more every day, non-communicable disease problem is a problem of people with less education and less resources.
Right.
And so you take a look, where do the tobacco companies advertise? They go to the poorer parts of the world and advertise to people who haven't been to school and don't know that smoking kills you, or too much sugar kills you, or driving while intoxicated or without a seatbelt kills you, those kinds of things.
Now, we at the IMF know that when we come with good rational, good advice, policy recommendations, it's going to be different for every country.
Yes.
Culture matters, history matters, civilization, relationship between people. How do you have this global position, and I know you're extremely active. How do you have this sort of tailored approach per country, per nature of audience that you deal with?
Well, Bloomberg Philanthropies gives a lot of money to fight non-communicable diseases, and each country, as you point out, is different. Social mores are different. The impact of taxes is different, and taxes are one of the real reasons, real ways you influence people to do what's in their own interest, but where they might not expect that. So if you want to get kids to stop smoking, raise cigarette taxes. And the more you raise them, the less they smoke. Now, some people say, well, taxes are regressive, but in this case, yes, they are. That's the good thing about them, because the problem is in people that don't have a lot of money. And so higher taxes should have a bigger impact on their behavior and how they deal with themselves. So I listen to people saying, oh, we don't want to tax the poor. Well, we want the poor to live longer so that they can get an education and enjoy life. And that's why you do want to do exactly what a lot of people say you don't want to do. The question is, do you want to pander to those people, or do you want to get them to live longer? And there's just no question. If you raise taxes on full sugary drinks, for example, they will drink less, and there's just no question that full sugar drinks are one of the major contributors to obesity, and obesity is one of the major contributors to heart disease and cancer and a variety of other things. So it's like saying, I don't want to stop using coal because coal miners will go out of work. Well, will lose their jobs. We have a lot of soldiers in the United States, in the U.S. Army, but we don't want to go start a war just to give them something to do. And that's exactly what you're saying when you say, well, let's keep coal killing people because we don't want coal miners to lose their jobs. The truth of the matter is there aren't very many coal miners left anyways, and we can find other things for them to do. But the comparison is a life or a job, or taxes or life. Which do you want to do? Take your poison.
So it's regressive, it is good. There are lots of tax experts in the room and fiscal experts, and I'm very pleased that they hear you say that. And they all say the two things in life which are absolutely certain. One is death, the other one is tax. So you use one to defer the other one.
That's correct.
Okay.
That is exactly right. Well said.
Yeah.
You said.
No, you said. Now, many of you in the room will remember Minouche, Nemat Shafik, wonderful member of the management team, deputy managing director, because you know how to identify the right people and the good contributors. You've actually drafted Minouche to join your task force for fiscal policy for health. She's joining a list of luminaries who are supportive of this idea that actually tax policy is very closely related to public health.
Yes, we're doing this with Larry Summers.
Right, but Minouche is in that group too.
Yes.
Which is good. So I think they or you or together you came up with the idea of sin tax. Sin tax. Can you describe what it is? You've already begun describing it, but give us the scope. Is it just tobacco? Is it more? How does it work?
Well, you can't tax everything. You can't take on every issue. So I think you've got to decide what things would you get the biggest bang for the buck, we would say, in the United States. Smoking will kill 1 billion people this century.
Oof.
In spite of all of the reduction in smoking in the Western world, and China's even banned smoking in major cities, North America, South America, it's very hard to find a restaurant where you can smoke anymore. But having said that, obesity is going to kill more people. So
did you say, Michael, 1 billion
billion people will die from smoking in the next century.
In spite of the measures that have been taken.
In spite of all the progress we've made. Yeah, I joked, and the press, of course, made a bigger joke out of it. I said, with all of the work my foundation's done to reduce smoking, when I get to heaven, I'm not stopping for an interview. I'm walking straight in. I earned it. But obesity is going to be worse. And obesity is another one of those things. More people die from obesity today than starvation. It's the first time in the history of the world where that is true. And that's because we really have brought a lot of people out of abject poverty. In fact, in the last couple of decades, we've reduced poverty by 50% around the world, if you measure poverty by a roof over your head, a meal in your stomach, and being literate. And it's all through global trade. So when we start having trade wars, you're going to hurt an awful lot of people. And it's the same people that get hurt every time.
Yeah.
We always talk about helping the poor, and then we do things that really hurt the poor. We're doing it in America, where we talk about better schools and then allow bad teachers in front of the classroom. We talk about it in America, we're going to encourage them to not smoke, and then in some states are afraid to raise cigarette taxes, those kinds of things. But you got to decide which things you want to work on. And as you pointed out, some countries are different than others. In some countries, for example, there are no doctors. And so trying to find a solution to a society that doesn't have doctors, what do you do if you need aid? And Kelly Henning, who runs our public health practice at Bloomberg Philanthropies, came up with this idea. In Tanzania, we teach high school graduates how to do cesareans and appendectomies. Why? Because there are no doctors. If you need either one of those operations and don't get it, you die. So an inexperienced person can't do worse than 100% fatality rate. And the truth of the matter is they're relatively simple operations, and you can teach people how to do them. If every once in a while there's a complication, that person unfortunately dies. But instead of 100% of the people that need it dies, only 1% of the people die. And so you really can make a difference. But there's a good example of a tailored thing for one part of the world. And what we have in America, there are things that you can do, full sugar drinks and tobacco and those kinds of things. But in America, it's driving while intoxicated and better fire laws so people don't get trapped in their apartment if there's a fire. And in other places, it's different. In Africa, typically they use kerosene lanterns to heat and light their one-room house. If you sit around where every night there's a kerosene lantern going, you're going to die pretty quickly because the fumes from that are lethal. And so what do? There's a guy, an inventor, Olafur Eliasson, who created a little lamp that's solar-powered, and what we're trying to do is distribute those all over Africa so you have a light that doesn't kill you, and it has the added benefit you can take it when you go outside to use the bathroom.
Particularly for women.
Yeah, I mean, right now women are assaulted all the time. If you have a light and you shine it in somebody's eyes, they generally would run away. So there's another example of something where you have a specific solution to a problem that's unique to that part of the world.
Can you comment on, coming back to the sin taxes, assuming that we're talking about countries where tax actually matters, what did your foundation measure in terms of efficiency? Is it more efficient to raise brutally, or is it better if it's done gradually over the course of time?
I've always been a believer that if it's controversial, pulling the Band-Aid off right away is the only ways to do it. If you try to pull off the Band-Aid slowly, you're never going to get to the second step. And the way the political process works and the way the public's attention works and the press focus works, you can get people ginned up about one subject, and you damn well better do everything you need to do because they're not coming back to that subject later on. So I would urge everybody, particularly finance ministers. Finance ministers think about maximizing the resources and yes, but the ways you do that is to, for example, reduce the health care needs of the population. And if you can do that with a tax, it'll raise you some money, which is good if you're a finance minister. You always want more money. But the main thing it's going to do is going to reduce your expenses. And so a finance minister, I think, has both responsibilities on both sides of the income statement, if you will, even if they think, well, it's not my job to worry about the health. Okay, but it is your job to increase revenue and reduce expenses.
Right.
And this is the way you do it.
So is that how you deal with them when you meet them? You explain the cost-benefit analysis of that and take into account a bit of medium term?
Yes, but the other thing I always try to do is to convince any government official that it is in their interest or the elected official they work for's interest to do something, because I'm enough of a cynic to think that most, not all, but most elected officials care about getting reelected. And so that explains why single-issue advocacy groups like the NRA and the AARP and the teachers' unions, those kinds of groups in America, why they're so powerful, because they have a lot to say as to whether you get reelected to your job. And elected officials, they want to have a career in government. And if they lose an election, then they go out and they don't know what to do. It's hard to get a job. They'll never have another secretary, car, office. Nobody's ever going to call them and ask what you think. And so you can really influence them. But what they care about is this good or not good for me in the next election? And so I would say to the finance minister, if you're not elected, at least your boss who appointed you is running for office again. And this is what's going to help. And I think you can see it in the American government. I can't speak for other governments, but unfortunately in America we are very much tied to that whole concept of, if you want my support, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I want you to do, and if you don't get my support, you're not going to get reelected. And we have industries that are supervised and regulated by people who take campaign donations from them, which is an outrage. We have an awful lot of evidence of people giving donations to campaigns and then asking for favors, whether it's at the city, state, or federal level. These kinds of conflicts of, I'm going to rent an apartment from somebody that I regulate.
I think I know where you're going.
Well, then I don't have to go any further, and I can ultimate deniability.
No, I'm really interested in one point that you made about the vested interests and the lobbying forces, because there are favors on the one hand, but sometimes also there is pushback. And you're invested a lot of your own money through the foundation, trying to reduce advertising campaign, trying to convince people that drinking some of those sugar loaded drinks is not good for them, and you did experience pushback. How do you deal with that, and what is the solution?
Well, the cigarette companies and the full sugar drink companies, just to name two of the industries, and they're hardly the only ones, they advertise to people that are susceptible to having their behavior changed by advertising. That's what advertising is all about. You decide, for example, advertisers want to have young people who they can change using from one kind of deodorant to another one. They don't want to advertise to people my age who are stuck and I've been using it for 20 years and I'm going to use it until I die. So you go to where the advertisers are spending their money, and you try to convince that group of people that they should change their behavior, and the cigarette and tobacco companies try to influence them in the other direction. And generally, I've always believed that people are a lot smarter than our elected officials think they are. It's just that you have to explain it to them carefully and understand that we live in a world more and more where everything's in 140 or 280 characters, and people all of a sudden are willing to debunk science and say things that they know are patently not true, which makes it more difficult. People say, oh, gravity's just a theory. Yeah, but every time I do that, it falls down. So gravity may be a theory, and maybe at the speed of light it doesn't work that way. But that doesn't mean that you should bet that things aren't going to fall. And so you're dealing with a difficult world being made more difficult all the time by social media, where you can say anything a zillion times. Nevertheless, we've got to save lives. And you've just got to convince them, no matter, the cigarette companies say smoking is good for you. Well, that's just not true. And how do you convince them? In simple terms, you say, you know, look, your neighbor just died from cancer. They were smoking. Your other neighbor's still alive and is not. Maybe that's a ways to do it. Look at all the people who are overweight and, you know, just stand outside funeral homes and you'll see those are the bodies being carried in a lot more than those who are not. But there are ways to get to people and to convince them of what's right for them. And the other thing you've got to do is make it relevant. We all care about in a maybe a selfish way, maybe not, ourselves and then our families and then our businesses and maybe country. And so you got to go and change. We talk about climate change and what's going to happen in 2050. Don't waste your time talking about that. I don't know about you, but at my age, I'm not going to see 2050. What I am going to see is right now, if my grandchildren get taken to the hospital with an asthma attack, or if my daughters or I come down with stomach cancer from drinking polluted water or that sort of thing. So if you change the climate stuff to the environmental focus, you will get people's attention a lot more, and they'll say, oh, that is, I do care about that. You know, we got to clean the air because my daughter is suffering from asthma. 2050 is hard to get your concept around. So it's figuring out how to reach people, which the tobacco companies and the full sugar drink companies and others work very hard at, and they have lots of paid professionals. And so what my foundation does is try to give the anti-groups money to go and get paid professionals who know how to approach people.
Okay. Sustainable Development Goals expect that by 2030 the non-communicable disease will have decreased by 30%. Some of my tax skeptics here will say, is those sin taxes, are they really efficient? How do you measure the results? What would you say to them? Well, I assume we want to convince them that sin tax is actually...
I mean, it depends which sin you're talking about. Some sins are easier to tax than others. And some sins in one part of the world are not sins in other part of the world. And I think we all very much think of things in our own little cocoon of the way we grew up and the people we know, and we are friends. We have this cycle. We keep reinforcing our beliefs among ourselves. And
you're right. There are countries where being big
or
is good.
Prostitution's a good example. Unfortunately, there's parts of the world where it's very legal, and even part of the United States is legal in Nevada. Nobody thinks about that. But what we call sin isn't necessarily what other people call sin. Having said all of that, some things are easy to tax and some things aren't. You can tax stuff at the manufacturing level, but for example, oxycodone, which is killing an enormous number of people, 70,000 people we estimate last year in the United States, you can go to the drug manufacturers and tax or regulate them, say you can't sell it, say you can only sell it in certain packages and that sort of thing. Fentanyl and heroin is much harder to tax because there's no one source. You can make fentanyl in your bathroom with a few test tubes and a few chemicals. Can't get to that. So taxes work in some cases and not others. For example, another sin tax that works, if you want to get young people to stop smoking, raise taxes. If you want to get in America, and it's not true in other parts of the world, but in America you want to get older people to stop smoking, taxes have relatively little impact. It is the fact that you can't smoke in most places. So we have laws in most cities in America. You can't smoke in the workplace, and you can't smoke in the restaurant, and you can't smoke in the theater. And pretty soon, if I can't smoke anywhere, I stop smoking. But adults will stop feeding their family before they stop feeding their addiction. They will find the money to buy cigarettes at almost any price. Young people don't have the disposable income. So taxes in America, smoking young people, denying you the place to smoke for older people in America.
Right. Okay, so either tax it, particular audience, make it totally inconvenient, another particular audience, but in any event, identify what is actually going to make people tick. And
yes,
that's going to be a factor of who they are.
It's also easier. We have a saying at Bloomberg Philanthropies, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Smoking consumption, you can manage. Yeah. Because they're all made by big companies generally. There's some places that make one-off cigarettes. But for the first time in modern history, total smoking worldwide has started to go down. And that's one of the reasons is China now has joined the club. And China is just so big that it influences the statistics all the time.
Was that the Olympics?
I don't know it was just that. Maybe they're trying to do something right. Who knows what influences government to do things. But it probably was the public saying to their government, we want to do it. You know, the Chinese government is no less impacted by what their constituents, i.e. citizens, voters, want than any place else. We think that other governments just don't pay attention and only our government does. That's not true. The Chinese government, I've always thought, is very cognizant of what their people want. Sometimes it's something that we don't understand why they want, but they don't understand why we want some things.
Yeah. Never one size fits all. Let me take you to another matter which really is important to you, and you started making policy decisions in 2003, and that's the protection of the environment. What do you think is heading in the right direction? So I'm trying to move us in a positive mode. In terms of climate change and tackling climate change, do you see either at city, state, nation levels good progress?
At least in America, and I would bet some money it's true around the world, governments have very little influence. It is the private sector, both corporations and individuals, because they think it's in their self-interest to do so. So, for example, in America, our federal government has done nothing. Obama did get a pro-environmental bill passed, and Trump's claimed credit for stopping it. But the truth of the matter is it's been tied up in court. It's never been implemented, so there's nothing to stop. But in the United States, if you can take a look, individuals are turning off their air conditioners before they go out for the day. Didn't do that before. Reducing energy consumption in the cities, and the pollution that comes from energy may be done outside, but if you reduce the energy consumption here, you will reduce the pollutants over there. People are painting their roofs white because it reflects off the sun. That's particularly true in New York, where the roofs tend to all be flat. Saves your electricity. People will buy, all other things equal, they'll buy more fuel-efficient cars because it reduces the amount of money they have to spend. So individuals are doing things, and corporations are really, in America, leading the charge on environment because their customers are demanding that they are pro-environment. Their employees want to work for a place that they're proud of and is pro-environment. And their investors in particular say the big money pools of money, endowments and pension funds and that sort of thing, the money managers come in and say our beneficiaries want us to invest in a socially responsible way. What are you doing in the environment? And they ask that even before they ask about next quarter's earnings. So it's the corporations are doing things. And then there's social pressure on corporations. They just don't want somebody to criticize them. So you never see somebody on television criticizing all of the climate stuff that we've been working on if they are business people. Why? If you were in your company, you had a plant right by the water, and you said, I'm not going to do anything about protecting this plant. I don't believe the oceans are going up. That's a commie plot. You'd get fired.
Yeah.
What your board would say to you, what do you mean? You haven't built a wall, you haven't moved the plant, you don't have an insurance policy, you don't have an alternative site, we don't have a backup plan in the middle of the night if a tsunami comes in. You don't have that, you can't run the company. And so it's people are going out and for their own interest, the company for their stockholders' interest and for management to stay in office. And for individuals, their own interest of maybe they think about the air for their daughter with an asthma attack, but certainly they think about their bottom line of having to spend more of their electricity bill or whatever. Whereas governments, at least in America and probably elsewhere, they talk a lot about it, but in the end, I think most people get driven by what's right for themselves and their families and their company. And if I'm trying to sell an environmental agenda, it is to point out to them, you really benefit. I can just tell you when Bloomberg goes out and tries to hire the best and the brightest of engineers, for example, where there's a really competitive market for people with skills, one of the things we say is, you know, if you go to work for this other company, you're making a bunch of people rich. You go to work for Bloomberg, all its profits go to the foundation. And we are working on the environment, and if you work for us, you're going to help cure polio and malaria and smoking and all of that sort of stuff. And that really sells. The young people in this day and age want to be involved in a place where they're proud. And so it's in the company's self-interest to do it.
Yeah, I think markets are actually beginning to tell us that as well, because when you compare the success and even the return on green finance, for instance, at the moment, it's yet too small, and we need a lot more than that. But it's growing, and it's growing
We
fast.
have an organization in America, and then one that, thanks to Mark Carney and the G20, that deals for the rest of the world, where companies can report their environmental footprint on a comparable basis. And so investors who want to invest more socially responsible can pick and choose. And the nice thing is the competition between companies for the investment dollars, not just for bragging rights, it's a real thing for the investment dollars, is based on this. The more you disclose, the harder it is to hide something, and the more you can satisfy your customers and investors.
Do you think that's an area where tax actually matters? Because we have a view here at the IMF that actually taxing, pricing carbon emission and taxing through the process is actually an efficient way. And some governments have agreed with that, although using a relatively small value, too small to actually catch up with the Paris climate arrangement.
Well, going through all of the aggravation and bad press and hurting your electability to do something small never made any sense to me. If you're going to do it, do it, because you're going to be tarred with making that decision anyways, and down the road, if you're right, you'll be a very big hero. I remember when we put a smoking ban in New York, I got a lot of one-finger waves when I did a parade. But then, today, nobody would go to a restaurant where people smoke. I remember Christy Whitman, she was the governor of New Jersey, called me up when we put the smoking ban in, and she said, "Thank you so much for doing this. You've done the most wonderful thing for New Jersey. Everybody's going to come from New York City across the Hudson River every night to New Jersey." And about 3 months later, in all fairness to Christy, who's a nice person, she called me up and she said, "I got to, in all fairness, tell you, I am today introducing a bill in the New Jersey legislature banning smoking." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Because my son has not spent a night in New Jersey since you put the smoking ban in." So sometimes people understand, and there's a handful of people that complain, but in the end, most of those people that complain today would say, "Yeah, I didn't like it, but you did save my life."
Yeah.
So doing the right thing, the good news is most times, not all, but most times, it's also good for the bottom line. It's also good for your electability. And it's certainly good, I guess, if you get to heaven and got to decide whether to get in or not.
So $70 per carbon ton rather than one. I get it. It's the Band-Aid
Well,
approach.
it'd be best if everybody just stopped polluting.
Yeah.
But that's a harder thing. Carbon tax does let you allocate resources and decide what's the better and what's the least dangerous, least damaging thing that you can do.
Yeah.
And we are going, incidentally, in the direction of, when it comes to climate change, renewables are going to take over the world, just because that you have this source that is basically cost-free once you get by the original capital and investment and a little bit of maintenance. We're going from coal to natural gas. Nobody's going to stop that as long as you let the free market work, because natural gas is so much cheaper. So we've put a lot of money into the Sierra Club to push people to close their coal-fired power plants. But I suspect that some of it, not all, but some of it would have happened anyways, and it's going to continue. The place where it doesn't work is where government says we're not going to let the free market work. We will subsidize something that is killing people. And you got to really question why, and what happens when the public really realizes what's happening and comes back and said, "You were doing what?" And if I were subsidizing some of that stuff, I'd be worried about that.
You recently said, Michael, and I'm going to quote you, "Artificial intelligence is not taking over the world, but it is costing jobs." You also said that artificial intelligence can never replace human beings. In the end, it is humans who will always make the decision.
Yes.
And we all hope that is true. Yet, jobs are a big issue. They have to come from somewhere, and there is disruption at play at the moment. So where do you think the jobs of tomorrow will come from?
Well, I think we live in an analog world, for a start. I know we all have digital things, but people still want to deal with the human being. And one of the things my company focuses on is if you have a question, you hit a button, we call you right back, speaking the language that you speak, because artificial intelligence has told us that. And we have an expert on the part of our system that we know you use. Artificial intelligence has told us that. And we may even use a computer with artificial intelligence to get you the answer, but we're delivering it human being to human being. And people want that kind of recognition and respect. So I'm a big believer that we still have to communicate. And anything where you need people to communicate, selling or help desks or things like that, or healthcare, and where maybe you can do an operation with a computer, but holding your hand in bed when you want some support, computer's not going to do that for a very long time. So I think there still is that. I think income inequality is a very big problem, but the bigger problem is you can take money from the rich and move it over to the poor. If you do it too much, then the rich stop producing and everybody loses. But there is most places have graduated income taxes to do that. The problem is the poor want more than a handout. They want the dignity of a job. They want to be able to go home and say, I am contributing to my family. And so you've got to create jobs, and jobs that they think and probably are meaningful. So just jobs where I put a piece of paper on your side, you move it back to me, that's not sufficient. We have to do other things. The first thing to do is to get rid of some of these impediments to job creation. For example, in the United States, we have two things, one of which is brilliant and one of which is used all the time but is dysfunctional. We just don't think of it this way. We have minimum wages. And minimum wage means that the employer has to pay up to that level for their employees. So what would go through an employer's mind if they have to raise the amount of money they have to pay one of their employees? It is, can I do with fewer employees? But we don't want companies to cut back the number of people they employ. What we really should be trying to do is convince them to employ more people. And in the interest of giving people a living wage, we are getting them to lose their jobs. Not everybody, but some. There's another system we have in America called an earned income tax credit, which has little to do with taxes.
Support.
Pardon?
That we very strongly support. In
yes, and what earned income tax credit does, number one, it shares the burden, not just the employer, but all the taxpayers pay it, which is fairer since everybody has an interest in this. And it's a de minimis amount to everybody, whereas it's a lot of money to a small group of people. But it encourages employers to hire more people because the government is subsidizing the cost of employing that person. And unfortunately, the politics work in one direction and nobody really understands the other one. One thing we did in New York City when I was mayor is we went to the tax computer and figured out who would qualify for the earned income tax credit, which is typically something like $5,000 subsidy a year. We filled out the application for everybody that qualified that wasn't getting it. We sent it to every single taxpayer that qualified with a stamped envelope. All they had to do is sign and stick it in, and they were going to get $5,000, and once you start, you get it all year. 20% never returned it. We could never figure out where those 20%, why they wouldn't do it, but 80% we signed up. And this gets you back to a lot of the programs that we in government create to help people. We create it, but we don't make it easy to use. Why? Because then we've got to be held responsible for how efficient it is, whether it works, whether we delivered the service well, and who's going to pay for it. So the best thing if you're in government is to vote a benefit, but then never deliver it. And that's typically what is done. We always talk about helping the poor, and then the poor never seem to move out of poverty. And I can tell you why. Because we only talked about it. We even passed a law, but it had nothing to do with really delivering a service. And if we were to go back and hold elected officials responsible for what they voted for back when and all the promises they made, they would leave the room very quickly. They would not stand that pressure.
Interesting. So you focused on the 80% versus 20%. If I look back at my own experience as finance minister, regrettably, we actually focused on the 20% whom we thought might abuse the system, rather than think about the 80% that needed the benefit.
Always going to be some abuse. We had, we have something called food stamps. It's the long name for what the program is, but it's a program where you have to work to get food stamps. What we found was there were a handful of people who signed up under different names, and they were getting 4 and 5 times the amount that they were supposed to get, which meant that we couldn't take care of some other people who really deserved it. And the public is willing, I've always thought, to support programs if they think that they're efficient and going to the people that they were designed to help and actually helping. So what we did is we fingerprinted people so you could only register once. Now, there was a lot of yelling and screaming and saying, we're invading your personal space by looking at your fingerprints. Well, that may be, but you can't come to work for New York City unless we fingerprint you first. So it's not unreasonable to think that the beneficiaries of our program would get fingerprinted too, and we're just stopping people from breaking the law, which is hurting other people. When I finished office, the governor changed the policy and said, well, if there's no corruption now, if nobody's double dipping, then there's no reason to have fingerprinting. Except the only reason that they weren't double dipping was fingerprinting. So I don't know what's happened since then. I've been out of office for a while, and I've stayed away from looking. But common sense says there are some people that will take advantage of your good will, of your interests, and trying to do the right thing. To some extent, you just have to live with a certain amount of leakage and corruption, because if you don't have that, then you don't help the vast bulk of the people. But it's also true that if you've got a system that has a lot of corruption in it, the public's not going to stand for that. So you've got to stand up and say, no, we are not going to allow this. And if we have to stop the program until we get it to be to have only a minimal amount of corruption, we're just not going to do it. And elected officials, once they give a benefit, don't ever want to take it away, even if people don't really benefit from it.
You'll be interested to know that the IMF is going to look much more deeply into the corruption issues that you've just mentioned, and we regard that as one of our priorities, precisely for the reason that you mentioned: trust. Will people actually have the confidence that things are fair?
And there's a lot of parts of the world where there is a lot of corruption, and it's typically where you don't have good government. You haven't had good government for a long time, we have a good example would be part of the United States, Puerto Rico, where a hurricane took out their infrastructure. They've had no electricity, and then yesterday again the entire island was put into blackness. This was a poll that came down, but they have, unfortunately, for years never had the discipline to make sure they were getting a good service. Nobody ever went back and said, are we giving business to a company that can't do the job as opposed to a company that can? We're never going to hold people accountable. We give out a contract and never go back and say, we're not going to pay you unless you do it right. We just give it out sometimes to our friends rather than to, there was a place, I don't know if it was Puerto Rico or St. John's, one place we were working where they hired a company that had 2 employees, I think it was Puerto Rico, to redo all of the electrical work in Puerto Rico, which would have taken them 1,000 years. You needed 1,000 linemen to do it, and they had given it to somebody that had no business doing it. And we unfortunately do that, and the press doesn't write about it, and we don't read the press anyways, and we don't have time, and we're depending on our elected officials to do it right. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, and if they don't, we all suffer.
Michael, I have a ritual set of questions now that we ask all our supreme guests for this particular moment.
Lightning round?
Okay, you have very few seconds for each of them. The first question is,
yes,
if you could have done or been something different professionally, what would it be?
Oh, a professional golfer, no question about that. I would win the Masters.
All right, the second one. Who do you wish you could meet that you have not already met?
Well, I wouldn't talk about somebody whose name has been in the paper and has a meteorological name that I haven't met. Well, I never met Albert Einstein, for example, who would have been fascinating to meet. There are a lot of people. I play a head game of, if I was going to put a table together of the 6 smartest people I've ever shook hands with. They don't even have to be alive.
Yeah.
Who are they? And I have 6. I'm not going to tell you who they are, but I have 6 that I think, when they say something, I think, I never would have thought of that. If I tried 1,000 times and got there, that's okay. Then it's luck. After 1,000, I'll give it to them. They really are smarter than me, and they've just. I'll give you one example. Henry Kissinger, who, whether you agree with his politics or not, is one of the smartest people. And the example, and you'll always look at Henry differently if you think about this. We have a balloon, and I push on the balloon here. We all go and see what's happening where we're pushing.
He looks at the other end.
Henry looks at the other side. That's exactly right. Of what's the impact every place else of an event here.
Yeah.
That's an intellectual level greater than most of us have.
Okay. Who would you not want to meet?
I better not answer that question.
Okay, for all those of you who think that I should have asked Michael Bloomberg whether he's considering running for another elected position, his ritual answer would have been, I'm constitutionally in a position to do so, and that's all we would get. So, to him, big round of applause at this point in time.
Thank you. Thank you.